Most people train their back with the wrong exercises, the wrong technique, or the wrong setup, and then wonder why it never grows. If you want a wide, thick, 3D back, you need to understand the anatomy, the biomechanics, and the programming that actually matter. Today, I'll give you the complete blueprint for building your best back ever. Before we can go into exercise selection, you need to understand the biomechanics and anatomy of the back musculature. Broadly speaking, the muscle groups that make up your back can be divided into 3 groups. First, we have the upper and the mid back, which are composed of the middle trapezius, the lower trapezius, and the rhomboids muscles. Broadly speaking, these muscles are primarily responsible for scapular retraction, bringing your shoulder blades back. You can think of pinching a pencil between your shoulder blades, and scapular depression, which you can think of as bringing your shoulder blades down, like you would when preparing for a bench press. The second group can be the lats and the teres major. These 2 muscles have broadly similar functions, so we can put them together. They're primarily responsible for shoulder extension, like during a pullover, shoulder reduction, like during an overhand pulldown, and shoulder horizontal abduction. Additionally, both the lats and the teres major do contribute to scapular movement slightly. As a result of the functions of the lats and the teres major, many movements that focus on the upper back do also train the lats and the teres major, but they typically won't be ideal for those muscles. And finally, the third group is simply the upper traps. Because the upper traps are primarily responsible for scapular elevation, they don't get trained that well during most upper back or lats teres major movements. Scapular elevation is simply a shrugging motion. During this motion, the levator scapulae would get trained too. You could certainly add the erector spinae muscles into your consideration for back training. The erector spinae muscles are responsible for extending the spine, and contrary to popular belief, they are not just your lower back. They go all the way from the base of your spine to the very top of your spine. Isolating this muscle can be a great way to add some thickness to your back. However, because this muscle gets a fair bit of stimulus from lower body training, I don't typically consider it as part of my back training. Instead, I would train it on your light days. The anatomy of the upper back versus lats and teres major also tells us something interesting. If you look at a picture of the anatomy of these muscles, you realize one thing. The lats and teres major make up most of the width of your back, whereas the mid traps, lower traps, and rhomboids make up most of the thickness of your back. So, if you find that your back is currently lagging in width, you may want to focus slightly more on the lats and teres major. Whereas if you find it's lacking more so in thickness, you may want to emphasize rowing motions or upper back training a bit more. Typically, this will mean performing more of those movements, with higher volumes and closer to failure. Speaking of anatomy, let's talk about the biomechanics of most back movements. There's one big problem with the way most movements train the back, and that's the resistance profile. We'll discuss this in more detail a bit later into the video, so stick around. But the gist of it is that most back movements tend to be most challenging in the shortened position, whereas a lot of research shows that we want it to be more challenging in the bottom or stretched position. So most back movements actually have the opposite resistance profile of what we want for hypertrophy. Now that we've discussed the anatomy and biomechanics of the back, we can touch on exercise selection. Broadly speaking, the upper back will be trained best with rowing variations, as they involve the functions of the upper back best. Most rowing motions involve plenty of scapular retraction and depression. Your scapula will get fully protracted at the start of the rep, getting a deep stretch into your mid traps, lower traps, and rhomboids. I'll give you a few solid exercise options for each major movement pattern. Let's start with rows. The single best row variation, in my opinion, is the chest-supported flexion T-bar row. This movement has a ton of unique benefits for back training. Let's start with the obvious one. The chest support pad makes it harder to cheat the motion by extending your hips and removes some fatigue. The second benefit of a flexion row specifically is that by flexing your spine on the way down, you get a deep stretch in your erector spinae, and by extending it on the way up, you're actually training this muscle dynamically through a full range of motion, which most movements don't allow you to do. Additionally, the combination of having a chest support pad and performing a flexion row in this movement makes it way easier to focus on spinal extension as opposed to flexing and extending the hips, which is something I see way too often on exercises that don't have a chest support, like the cable row. The way the great Arnold Schwarzenegger, for instance, performed cable rows was a lot of hip extension, aka involving the hamstrings, glutes, and adductors, alongside a fair amount of spinal extension. Ideally, for pure back development, we want to isolate a spinal extension, which a chest support makes more intuitive to do. For many people, I think doing flexion rows using a chest support is far more effective. Another cool benefit of this exercise is the resistance profile. As I mentioned earlier, most exercises for the back are most challenging in the shortened position and less challenging in the stretch, which is the opposite of what we likely want for hypertrophy. However, because of the way a T-bar moves, the moment arm is actually greater at the bottom versus the top, so it makes up for this discrepancy somewhat. For overall back development, it's really hard to beat the chest-supported flexion T-bar row. However, a solid alternative is a simple chest-supported machine row. Ideally, look for a machine where the moment arms behave similarly as a T-bar, where it's harder in the stretch and easier in the shortened position. If your machine doesn't allow for sufficient range of motion, feel free to use a chest pad for rows. If a chest-supported machine row, whether T-bar or traditional machine row, doesn't allow for a sufficient stretch, feel free to use a yoga block between the chest pad and your torso to increase the range of motion. The cable row is another great option that is often available at nearly any gym you train at. Since most cable rows are stack loaded, this can be a very good time-efficient option for training your upper back muscles. And if you're pretty kinesthetically aware, you can also do flexion rows on cable rows, although you need to make sure you're not just flexing and extending the hips. The final variation I recommend for rowing is the incline dumbbell row. All you need is a pair of dumbbells and a bench. It provides some chest support. It's a really easy superset with dumbbell pressing if you choose to do upper body days and want to superset 2 movements and save some time. And it's rather time efficient in the sense that all you need is a pair of dumbbells and you get going. However, with all of these movements, especially the non-T-bar row movements, I would heavily recommend performing kelso shrugs at the end of your sets. The reasoning is simple. Nearly all rowing variations are most challenging at the very top position. One way to make up for this discrepancy is to simply, when you can't get another full rep touching your torso, continue the set doing partials. At some point, you won't even be able to bend your elbows anymore. At this point, don't end the set. Perform kelso shrugs, simply protracting and retracting your scapula. This will give your upper back muscles some stimulus in their most stretched position, which will likely increase hypertrophy. In general, I think lengthened partials, performing partial reps in the stretch position, and lengthened supersets where you perform partials after you can't get another full range of motion rep are great options for back training. Now that we've covered rows for the upper back, let's cover vertical pulling patterns. My all-time favorite for lat training is likely the overhand pull down. As compared to a pull-up, it does feel a bit less fatiguing on account of being more supported by the thigh pad. It can also be slightly more time efficient in the sense that you don't need to load up a weight belt and get in position. It's also a bit more conducive to drop sets should you want to do that, since you don't have a floor of weight set at your body weight. Additionally, an overhand grip does stretch out the biceps a tiny bit more than an underhand grip. With that being said, pull-ups are a fine alternative, and I frequently do those as well. For both of these movements, I would recommend a roughly shoulder width grip to get a slightly deeper stretch on your lats. However, the truth is that neither of those movements are ideal for stretching out the lats. A cross-body pull-around or a dumbbell pull-over will do a far better job of this. A cross-body pull-around stretches out the lats a bit more than a traditional pull-down or pull-up would. You do need to train one arm at a time, but the extra stretch might be worth it. On the flip side, the dumbbell pullover both gives you a bit of a deeper stretch on your lats than a pull-up or a pull-down would, but it also increases resistance in the stretch, something very few back movements are able to do. The moment arms of the dumbbell pullover simply dictate that resistance is greatest and your arm is parallel to the floor, so the resistance drops off as you shorten the lats, and you never get into a fully shortened position. You're effectively doing half reps of shoulder extension, with the most resistance occurring in that deep stretch. To emphasize the stretch a bit more during most lat exercises, including pull-downs, pull-ups, and cross-body pull-rounds. Again, since these movements are hardest in the shortened position, you'll typically be able to get several reps as partials in the stretch at the end of a full range of motion set. Likewise, when you can't even bend your elbow anymore, I think you would benefit from doing just scapular pull-downs, just pure scapular depression, since your lats, teres major, and even your upper back muscles are responsible for this motion. Finally, let's talk about shrugs for the upper traps. I think the single best shrugging variation most people have access to is the seated dumbbell shrug. It provides a bit of support for your body, reducing fatigue slightly, as opposed to a standing variation. The dumbbells are also highly time efficient, as opposed to loading up a barbell. If you perform these strict, most people don't need much more than around 100 pounds per side. But if you are pretty strong and your dumbbells don't go that heavy, you do probably need to use a barbell. Or, if you have a dual cable station available that goes pretty heavy, you can also use a dual cable setup. This is far more time efficient than the barbell variation, so if you do have access to this, it is a good option. Finally, standing barbell, dumbbell, or even trap bar shrugs are a good option, although they do involve a bit more fatigue on account of being less supported and typically take a bit more time. Just like with most back movements, shrugs are most challenging at the very top. So, once you can get another full rep, keep going with partials until you can't move the weight anymore. Now that we've covered anatomy and biomechanics, let's talk about the most important part of back training, programming. We'll keep some of the most important variables for last, so make sure you stick around. Arguably one of the most important variables for training is volume, which can be quantified as how many hard weekly sets you do per muscle group. How much volume you do seems to determine around 25% of how much growth you observe. If you want to level up your training, check out MyoAdapt, the app I co-founded to help you apply the science from this channel. It builds evidence-based routines around progressive overload and smart exercise selection, lets you emphasize the muscles you care about, and tracks progress automatically. Train anywhere, at home or in a gym, in as little as 15 minutes, and switch between gyms seamlessly. Head to myoadapt.com and use code WOLF for a free 2-week trial. You can also book a free call below to see if we're a good fit. I'll work with you directly to optimize your training, nutrition, and recovery. Big thank you as always to Rascal Apparel for supporting the channel. You can use code WOLF for 10% off their training gear at rascalapparel.com. And well, how much volume should you do? Well, a meta-analysis by Pelin and colleagues showed that more growth is seen all the way to 30 to 40 fractional weekly sets. Importantly, direct lat training likely does stimulate your upper back muscles a bit as well, and vice versa. So don't think you need to be doing 30 to 40 sets of pull downs, 30 to 40 sets of rows, and 30 to 40 sets of shrugs every single week, because there is some carryover from one movement pattern to another. In general, around 15 to 30 sets of pull downs, pull-ups, rows, and shrugs is likely a great place to be for maximum hypertrophy. But how should you split up that volume across the week? Well, a meta-analysis on training volume per session by Remmert and colleagues showed that more growth is caused by all the way up to 11 sets per session. However, past around 11 sets per session, it's not really clear whether adding more volume will lead to much more growth. So, as a rule of thumb, for every 10 sets you do for your lats, add 1 session for your lats in per week. If you're aiming for 20 sets for your lats per week, that's at least 2 sessions for your lats a week. You can certainly split that volume across more sessions, say do 5 lat sets across 4 sessions per week for a total of 20 sets. But at minimum, add 1 session for that muscle for every roughly 10 sets you want to do. So typically for maximum growth, you likely would want to train your back 3 or 4 times a week, which an upper-lower split or a full body split are best suited to. Upper-lower 5 days a week, doing upper-lower, upper-lower, upper is a great routine for back growth because it allows you to split the back volume across 3 days and get a solid distribution of effective volume in. Alternatively, a full body split where you train the back at least 3 times a week is a great option too. Push-pull legs can work great as well if you're doing more moderate volumes, say 10 to 20 sets per week. However, if you're really pushing for higher volumes, I would recommend an upper, lower, or even a full body routine. Now that we've covered sets both per week and per session, we need to talk about reps. As far as rep ranges go, most of your training should take place in the 4 to 12 rep range, with some training in the higher rep ranges all the way up to around 30. As a rule of thumb, I think around 50 to 75% of your training in the 4 to 12 rep range and the remainder higher up. The research clearly shows sets of anywhere between 4 to 50 reps per set, provided you're going to failure or close to failure, stimulate similar muscle hypertrophy. However, sets between 4 and 12 reps have a practical edge, because research by our own lab showed that most lifters are most accurate at gauging how close to failure they are with sets of between 4 to 12. Above 12 reps, people tend to become less accurate, and since training to failure is so critical for back training, we do want to make sure we're training close to failure. Typically, sets of 4 to 12 will be the best suited to more compound movements, like pull downs and rows, whereas for more isolation style movements, say pullovers, cross-body pull-arounds, kelso shrugs, or shrugs in general, those can work pretty well in higher rep ranges as well. If you try to do compound movements in super high rep ranges, you might end up being quite out of breath, causing you to end the set prematurely before the target muscle reaches failure. But speaking of failure, how close to failure should you train? Well, a meta-analysis by Robinson and colleagues showed that the closer a set is taken to failure, the more growth it causes. There is some additional nuance to this discussion though. For one, a study by our own lab compared ending calf raises, a movement that is most challenging in the shortened position. Either ended at failure, when you couldn't get that last bit of the range of motion, or doing partials past failure. And we observed around 40% more growth when doing those partials past failure in a shortened biased movement. And importantly, most back movements are shortened biased, suggesting that the back musculature may benefit from doing partials after failure, like I mentioned earlier. On the flip side though, going to failure too early into the workout might cause excessive fatigue, compromising total tension across the session. Since if you go to failure super early into the workout, your performance on subsequent sets and exercises might be compromised, and in total, you might get less tension to the target muscle. This is more speculative, because not much research exists on this, but a study by Rafalo and colleagues did suggest that going to failure too early might compromise growth. So, as a rule of thumb, I would keep 1 or 2 reps in the tank earlier into the workout or earlier into an exercise, say on set 1 or 2, and then go closer to failure with every set, going to true failure or past failure for those last few sets. As far as rest times for back training go, things are a bit different than for other muscles. A meta-analysis by our own lab did show that 1 to 2 minutes of rest between sets was sufficient to maximize hypertrophy. However, most back movements are compound movements, and they typically utilize a larger fraction of your body's musculature compared to pushing movements. So I personally think that for most compound back movements, you want to rest between 1.5 and 2 minutes between sets. Whereas for more isolation style movements, like pullovers, shrugs, and kelso shrugs, you can likely afford to take 1 to 1.5 minutes. Additionally, if you're supersetting your back training with chest training or anything else, you'd likely want at least 45 seconds or 60 seconds between one movement and the next, just to catch your breath. There's also a few unique tips that only really apply to back training, because there's many mistakes people make when it comes to back training. The first is chasing excessive weight and compromising technique. And this mistake, in my opinion, is best summarized in a niche of the industry that focuses on bent over rows and plates per side. You see, there's a huge differential in how much weight you can lift with good versus worse technique in most back movements. And this is especially true for bent over rows. If you involve a ton of hip flexion and extension, raising and lowering your torso throughout the rep, that can really boost how much weight you can lift. However, at that point, most of the work is being done by your hamstrings, glutes, and adductors rather than your upper back musculature. So set some technical standards for how you perform the movements and only progressively overload when your body is ready for it, rather than forcing a certain rate of progressive overload. Because there's really no competition for who has the biggest bent over row, because presumably you're interested in growing muscle, not impressing people with 3 plates per side. So a few tips for staying strict. 1. Try to get your back as close to horizontal as possible and keep it there on every single rep. Don't let it go up and down again. There's also a difference between raising your torso and lowering it, which is hip flexion and extension, and rounding and extending your spine. Rounding and extending the spine is a function of the erector spinae musculature, which is your back and is worth growing. But if you're trying to train your back and your torso is rising and lowering, that is hip extension, and you're training lower body, which is not the goal. 2. Pay attention to your knee positioning. Many people extend and flex their knees on the way up and down to get a bit of extra oomph. And 3, to check all of this, make sure you take videos of your technique. Back training is probably the most often butchered of any muscle group. The second tip when it comes to back training is that free weights are awesome, but if you're pushing high row volume, include plenty of chest supported movements. Bent over rows are great, especially if you're short on time and you're trying to get stimulus for a variety of muscles in at once, or if you only have free weights because they're most versatile, like if you're training in a home gym. But if you're trying to push as much volume and stimulus to your upper back musculature as possible, you are likely better off including plenty of chest supported rowing variations, as these limit fatigue of the lower back musculature a bit and of the lower body as well. Tip number 3, deadlift variations or hip hinges in general might be okay at training the erector musculature, but don't count on them for actual back development. Deadlifts and hip hinges are almost certainly limited by hip extensor strength, rather than any upper back or lat musculature. Additionally, the stimulus efficiency, or the stimulus to fatigue ratio, of deadlifts and hip hinges for your upper back or for your lats is honestly, for lack of a better term, piss poor. Because you could likely get more stimulus on a per set basis, as indicated by them being the limiting factor, from something like a row versus something like a deadlift, or a rack pull even. Because as I mentioned, the very likely limiting factors to performance during deadlifts and hip hinges are your hip extensors, and not your upper back or your lat musculature. And that also applies to the erectors, because while yes, deadlifts do involve spinal extension isometrically, when it comes to maximizing stimulus for the erectors, you're likely better off doing a spinal extension isolation movement, because yet again, that will ensure that the erector spinae are the limiting factor and will also allow you to train them in a more stretched position. Here are a few technique tips when it comes to back training. First, try to catch the stretch on the way down. So, slow down the eccentric more as you reach into the stretch position. You can afford to be relatively quick on the way down as you start lowering the weight, that's the shortened position, but as you reach into the stretch, try to almost catch it and slow down until you naturally reach a pause in a deep stretch. Pause for about half a second to a second and then explode back up, using exclusively your back and not your lower body. Catching the stretch, pausing in the stretch, and exploding out of the stretch will all force your musculature to produce more tension in the stretch, which we suspect is likely better for hypertrophy. On the flip side, many people tend to pause in the peak contraction. Avoid doing this. For one, that portion of the movement is when your back musculature is most shortened, which is likely the least important part of the movement, so we don't want to emphasize it unnecessarily. And for another, that portion of the movement is already the most challenging, so you're making a relatively unproductive bottleneck to the movement even more of a bottleneck, at the expense of a more productive part of the movement. As I've mentioned before, another big technique pointer for rows is to focus on spinal flexion and extension, like a banana, both sides, whatever, versus simply raising and lowering your torso. One trains your lower body, the other actually trains your back. Another technique tip is about pull downs and pullovers. Avoid crunching your spine. Your ribs should remain the exact same position the whole set. If you notice your ribs kind of go down for those last few inches of a pull down, you're past failure. Try to keep your chest extended, chest up to the sky, and for pullovers, try to make sure that your ribs stay down the whole set. That crunching down motion is very tempting in order to get the weight moving and get through the sticking point, but in reality, that is spinal flexion. And spinal flexion is something your abs do, which presumably is not what you're trying to train during back training. When it comes to special techniques of the back, I'll keep it brief. I already mentioned a few of them. One is lengthened partials, simply performing half reps in the stretch position of the movement. This is likely a great use of lengthened partials since most back movements are most challenging in the shortened position. We unfortunately don't have any direct studies in the back when it comes to lengthened partials, but it does make sense that they would be beneficial. So I would cautiously use them for the time being. The same applies to lengthened supersets, which I think most people should be using for most back movements pretty much all the time. Basically, when you reach full range of motion failure, you can't quite touch your chest anymore for rows or can't bring it all the way down for pull downs, just do partials until you can't really move the weight anymore. Extend the set using Kelso shrugs for your rows and extend the set using scapular pull downs or just doing scapular depression for your pull downs and pull-ups. Drop sets and antagonist paired supersets can also be great for getting more back training into your routine. Both have been shown in several studies to save time off your workouts while delivering the same stimulus as more traditional training. For drop sets, simply do a hard set of maybe 4 to 12 reps, then immediately, without rest, drop the weight by 20% and repeat. You can double up on the drop set concept by doing both length superset, partials after failure, combined with a drop set. So you're getting a kind of double drop set of full range of motion drop setted to partials, and then that set drop setted to a lower weight, and you repeat the process. So set of 4 to 12, drop the weight by 20%, repeat immediately, drop the weight by 20% again, and repeat for 2 to 4 drops typically. Antagonist paired supersets can be a great way to save time off your workouts if you're performing upper body training days or full body training days. Simply superset any back movement with a movement that doesn't interfere with the muscles being used during back training. So you could superset any back movement with a tricep movement or a chest movement or a calf raise, or any movement that doesn't use the same muscles and doesn't produce excessive overall fatigue like being super out of breath. Take about 30 to 60 seconds between the back movement and the other movement and vice versa. And because you need pretty high volumes to maximize growth, for most people, you should be using these techniques to maximize volume across the week.